Sit back down. This is an engineering crisis, not a safety drill. My father, Richard, didn't even look at the load-bearing calculations I had placed on his mahogany desk. He swept his hand sideways. The 3 pages fluttered across the marble floor of the lobby. 7 contractors stopped talking and watched. I was 32 years old, wearing a high-visibility vest in the middle of his crowning achievement, a commercial tower 3 weeks away from its ribbon cutting. Go count hard hats. Elena, he said. He turned his back to me. Let the men handle the math. I didn't argue. I didn't cry. I knelt, gathered my papers, and walked out the glass doors. He thought I was running away. He had no idea what I was about to do. If you have ever been treated like a nuisance by the person who was supposed to protect you, let me know where you are listening from in the comments. You are not alone. And if you want to see what happens when a daughter finally stops shrinking, hit subscribe. Let me tell you how this really started. I spent my childhood in the corners of noisy construction sites, copying static load formulas while other girls played outside. By the time I was 10, I not memorized the cross-section requirements for core pillars. I used to leave my drafting sketches on his desk, hoping he would finally look at them and see me. He always brushed them into the trash. He told me women lacked the spatial thinking for structural engineering, steering me toward filing permits and safety checklists instead. It wasn't that he thought I was incapable. He just needed to be the only architect in the family. 4 hours before those pages hit the marble floor, I was 2 stories underground. The basement of the new tower smelled of damp concrete and curing epoxy. Upstairs, caterers were already measuring the lobby for champagne fountains. Down here, it was just me and a flashlight. As the site's designated safety compliance officer, my job was simple. Check the fire extinguishers, count the safety harnesses, sign the insurance forms. That was the box my father had built for me, but I wasn't looking at fire extinguishers. I was standing next to pillar column C4. I ran my bare hand over the gray surface. The concrete felt wrong. It was too smooth, lacking the dense aggregate texture it should have had for a load-bearing core. I leaned in with my light. There, barely visible to the untrained eye, was a hairline fracture. It was maybe 3 inches long, crawling up from the base. A microfracture. In a completed foundation, a crack like that didn't just happen. It meant the concrete mix was diluted, or the rebar inside was snapping under the weight of 50 floors. I pulled out a pair of calipers and a notepad. I documented the width. I checked 3 more pillars in the same sector. 2 of them had the exact same stress patterns. I printed the structural deviation report in the site trailer. 3 pages of undeniable proof that the foundation was failing. I took the pages straight to the main lobby, where Richard was holding court. I thought he would care about the building. I thought he would care about the thousands of people who would walk into it. Instead, he told me to sit back down. 30 minutes later, someone knocked on my apartment door. I hadn't even taken off my steel-toed boots. It was Trevor. My younger brother stood in the hallway wearing a $1,200 suit, holding a stack of laminated safety waivers. He didn't wait for an invitation before stepping into my kitchen. Richard wants these filed by morning, Trevor said. He dropped the clipboards on my counter. He always called our father by his first name when he wanted to sound like a senior executive. Make sure the dates match. We don't need the city inspectors holding up the ribbon cutting because you missed a checkbox. I'll file them, I said. Trevor looked around my cramped living room. He smiled. A tight, practiced expression. You know, if you just paid attention to the paperwork, he wouldn't have to yell at you in the lobby. It is not that hard. Elena. He let himself out. The deadbolt clicked shut. I did not touch the waivers. I walked into my bedroom, knelt on the floor, and pulled a steel safe from under the bed. I punched in the 5-digit code. The heavy lid popped open. Inside lay my structural engineer license. A top-tier, state-recognized certification with a gold seal. For over 6 years, Richard and Trevor believed I had failed my licensing boards. I let them believe it. I accepted a job as a low-level safety compliance officer, making $45,000 a year. I wore the neon vests. I counted the fire extinguishers. I let them humiliate me at company dinners. I did it because it was the only way Richard would keep me on the payroll, giving me physical access to his construction sites. I knew he cut corners, and someone had to secretly double-check his structural loads before he killed somebody. I reached past the license and pulled out a rolled drafting tube. I carried it to the kitchen, pushed Trevor's waivers off the edge of the counter, and unrolled the heavy paper. It was a foundation blueprint, dated 2 years ago. My blueprint. It detailed a deeply reinforced concrete core for the new commercial tower. Richard had thrown this exact drawing into the shredder. The extra steel would have cut into his profit margin. He hired an outside firm to draw a thinner core, saving him $3 million in materials. I weighed down the corners of my blueprint with 2 coffee mugs. I pulled the notepad from my pocket and looked at the cross-section requirements for column C4. My original design called for 40-inch reinforced columns. The ones they poured in the basement were 32 inches. I compared my safe structural limits against the microfracture measurements I had taken this afternoon. The math did not lie. The tower was already buckling under its own weight. I just needed the physical concrete to prove it. I kept my hands flat on the edges of the blueprint covering my kitchen counter. It was the exact structural draft I had placed on Richard's desk 2 years ago. I remembered the sound the thick paper made when he tore it straight down the middle. He hadn't even glanced at the load distribution numbers. He just leaned back in his leather chair and told me I didn't understand the reality of business. He said my extra steel would eat $3 million of his profit margin, and that safety buffers were a suggestion, not a mandate. He chose his wallet over the foundation of a 50-story building. I rolled the blueprint back into its tube. Paper wasn't going to be enough to stop him. I needed the concrete. At 1:45, I parked 3 blocks away from the construction site. Richard had issued a new directive that afternoon. No unauthorized personnel on the grounds after hours. Not even the safety team. The front gates were padlocked and guarded. I went around to the east alley, where I knew the temporary fencing was loose. I slipped through the gap, catching my forearm on a jagged piece of wire. The metal tore through my jacket and took a layer of skin with it. I ignored the sting. I kept to the shadows of the heavy machinery, moving quietly down the temporary wooden stairs into the second level of the basement. It was pitch black, smelling of damp earth and diesel fuel. I turned on a small pen light and found column C4. I pulled a battery-powered core drill from my canvas bag. It was heavy, meant for extracting solid material for testing. I pressed the diamond bit against the smooth, gray surface of the 32-inch pillar. The drill whined. A high, mechanical grinding noise that echoed off the bare walls. I pushed hard, letting the bit bite deep into the structure. 2 minutes later, I extracted a perfect 4-inch cylinder of concrete. I slid the gray core into a clear plastic tube and capped it tightly. I moved to the next pillar and did the same thing. 3 samples. 3 pieces of undeniable physical truth. I was zipping the canvas bag when a heavy beam of yellow light swept across the floor. Hey! Who's down there? It was a private security patrol. 2 men with heavy flashlights were coming down the wooden ramp. My boots were covered in white dust. I had nowhere to run. I grabbed my bag and wedged myself into an unfinished ventilation shaft just behind the pillars. The metal edges dug into my shoulders. I pulled my knees to my chest and stopped breathing. The flashlight beam swept right past my boots, illuminating the fresh dust on the floor. I waited in the dark, shivering in the damp air, hiding like a thief inside a building that was supposed to be my family's legacy. They lingered for 4 agonizing minutes before turning back upstairs. I climbed out of the shaft, my arms bleeding and my clothes covered in dirt. but the plastic tubes in my bag were safe. I drove straight to an independent material testing lab on the edge of the city. I handed the samples to a technician I trusted, paid in cash, and went home to wait. The countdown to the ribbon cutting had officially begun. The independent lab called me 48 hours later. I drove out to their suburban office and paid the remaining $200 in cash. The technician handed me a single manila folder. I opened it in the front seat of my car. The numbers were absolute. The concrete mix used in the basement core was diluted by 30%. The tensile strength was nowhere near the requirement for a 50-story commercial high-rise. Richard hadn't just cut corners. He had hollowed out the building's spine, but a question remained. The city required a signed safety compliance form before a foundation of that scale could be legally poured. As the designated safety officer, I had never signed one. I drove home, opened my laptop, and tried to log into the company's central archive. An error message popped up. Access denied. Trevor had revoked my administrative privileges 3 weeks ago. He told me it was a routine security update for lower-level staff. He forgot that I was the one who set up the temporary vendor accounts last spring. I typed in the credentials for a hidden admin backdoor I had created last spring just in case. The server let me right in. I navigated to the restricted compliance folders, clicked on the foundation approval packet, and scrolled to page 14. There it was. The official safety sign-off. My name was printed at the bottom. Above it sat a signature in blue ink. It wasn't my handwriting. The loop on the first letter was too sharp. The slant was entirely wrong. Someone had forged my name on a binding legal document. I clicked the file properties and checked the digital log. It showed exactly who had scanned and uploaded the document to the city server. User ID Trevor. I stared at the screen. The hum of my refrigerator suddenly sounded very loud. When Trevor wrecked his first car at 17, Richard bought him a new one and blamed the county for a poorly lit intersection. When I was 10 minutes late to a site inspection, I was publicly reprimanded and docked a week's pay. Trevor always got the safety net. I always got the blame. I used to think it was just favoritism. I was wrong. A family built on shortcuts always needs a designated shock absorber for when things eventually crash. Trevor didn't just forge a signature to save time. He and Richard knew the foundation was fundamentally compromised. If the pillars ever gave way, if the building collapsed and federal investigators came looking for someone to blame, the paperwork would point directly to the incompetent safety officer who signed off on the pour. Me. They weren't just keeping me small. They had designated me as their collateral damage. My own brother was willing to send me to federal prison to protect his profit margin. I didn't cry. I didn't reach for my phone to scream at him. The hollow ache in my chest simply hardened into something cold and permanent. I hit print. The machine whirred to life, spitting out the forged document and the digital upload log. I slid the fresh pages into a red folder alongside the concrete lab results. I had the criminal evidence to put my own brother in handcuffs. Now, I just needed the right audience. The afternoon sun faded into dusk, casting long shadows across my cramped living room. I sat at the kitchen table, surrounded by paper. The independent lab results lay on my left. The permit with my forged signature sat on my right. My original blueprint, the one calling for 40-inch reinforced columns, rested in the center. I spent 3 hours cross-referencing the math. I calculated the exact wind shear velocity required to snap the diluted 32-inch concrete pillars my father had poured in the basement. The numbers were absolute. The tower wasn't just non-compliant. It was a standing coffin. I organized the documents, compiling the hard evidence into a single, comprehensive structural failure report. A heavy knock rattled my front door. I opened it. Trevor stood in the hallway, wearing a tailored navy blazer, looking down at his phone. He didn't look up when he spoke. "Richard sent me to collect your site credentials," Trevor said. He stepped past me into the apartment and held out his hand. your physical ID badge, and your secure network token. Let's go. The building opens tomorrow. I said, exactly. Which means we are locking down event security today. Trevor replied. He finally looked at me. A familiar, arrogant smirk on his face. Richard doesn't want you wandering around the VIP reception in your little yellow vest. You have been a headache all week. Hand them over. Elena. He needed me to stay small so his own ego could stay big. He stood in my kitchen, entirely confident that he held all the power. He thought stripping my access would paralyze me. I did not argue. I did not defend my work. I walked over to the entryway table, unclipped my corporate badge from my lanyard, and picked up the digital token. I dropped both of them into his outstretched palm. Trevor slipped them into his pocket. Smart choice. Do yourself a favor and stay home tomorrow. It is better for the family. He walked out. The deadbolt clicked shut. I was completely locked out. I had no physical access to the property and zero entry to the corporate servers. My father and my brother had built a fortress to protect their lies, and they had successfully exiled me to the outside. I walked back to the kitchen table. They took my plastic badge, but they left the paper on my counter. I opened my desk drawer and pulled out a heavy mahogany box. Inside rested a steel, self-inking stamp. I had not touched it in over 6 years. I placed the final page of my structural report on the wooden table. I positioned the metal frame perfectly over the bottom right corner. Pressed down with both hands, and let the spring mechanism engage. A loud click echoed in the quiet room. I lifted the steel press. A bright red, perfectly crisp circle remained on the paper. It displayed my full legal name, my state license number, and the title Registered Structural Engineer. Trevor had forged my initials in blue pen to hide a crime. I stamped my authority in red ink to expose it. I slid the thick stack of papers into a rigid manila envelope and sealed the flap shut. The evidence was undeniable. I just needed to bypass my father's local connections and get it into the hands of someone who could not be bought. The ink dried fast. It was 8:15 on a Thursday morning. I carried a single cardboard box into the corporate headquarters to empty my cubicle. The ribbon-cutting ceremony for the tower was exactly 27 hours away. The 14th floor was mostly empty. The administrative staff had already gone down to the site to arrange the floral centerpieces and organize the VIP seating. But the main executive conference room was occupied. The heavy glass walls were designed for transparency, but they left a 2-inch gap near the hinges that leaked every word spoken inside. I stopped near the supply closet, staying just out of their direct line of sight. Richard stood at the head of the long oak table. Trevor sat to his right, leaning back with his hands behind his head. 5 of our primary subcontractors occupied the remaining leather chairs. 7 men in expensive suits, drinking dark roast coffee and eating catered pastries. Richard held a crystal tumbler of sparkling water. He raised it toward the ceiling. The city will not be a problem, Richard said. His voice carried down the quiet hallway. I had a long dinner with the zoning board chairman last night. $75,000 to a re-election committee buys a lot of administrative goodwill. The local inspectors are going to walk through the lobby, smile for the press cameras, and sign the occupancy permit before the mayor even finishes his speech. Trevor laughed. The contractors chuckled, a collective sound of wealthy men congratulating themselves. They were celebrating a finished job. They had successfully constructed a 50-story hazard with 32-inch diluted pillars, and they believed their bank accounts had insulated them from any consequences. Richard was a man who understood his local ecosystem. He knew exactly who to buy, what their price was, and how to deliver the payment without leaving a paper trail. He thought he had secured the perimeter. He believed his power was absolute. He was operating on outdated information. Yesterday afternoon, after I pressed my red structural engineer seal onto the failure report, I did not drive to the city zoning office. I knew local politics were a dead end. Instead, I drove to an overnight courier and paid $42 for priority morning delivery. I bypassed the city ecosystem entirely. I mailed the sealed envelope straight to the state capitol, addressed directly to State Building Inspector Hayes. Inspector Hayes was not a local politician looking for a quick campaign donation. He was a state-level enforcer with a 22-year reputation for shutting down corrupt developers and firing compromised municipal officials. He did not attend dinners with CEOs. He did not care about the economic impact of a new commercial tower. He cared about load-bearing math and the rigid letter of the law. I pulled my phone from my pocket and checked the delivery status. The tracking history showed the package had been signed for at his private desk at 7:30 this morning. I watched Richard take a sip of his water. I walked over to my cramped cubicle. I placed my pens, my favorite coffee mug, and a framed photograph into my cardboard box. I left my neon yellow safety vest draped over the back of my chair, a bright flag of the job I would never do again. I carried my box toward the elevator. The ribbon cutting was tomorrow at noon. The only question left was whether Inspector Hayes could drive 3 hours fast enough to beat the mayor to the podium. The lobby of the new commercial tower smelled of expensive, catered food and fresh paint. Over 315 people packed the space between the velvet ropes. Local politicians, major investors, and my entire extended family stood in the front rows. Richard stood at the mahogany podium, beaming under the bright lights. He held a pair of oversized golden scissors. I stood 50 feet away, near the catering tables, still wearing my neon yellow safety vest. Trevor caught my eye from the VIP section. He smirked and shook his head, looking at my vest like it was a stain on the event. Today, we don't just open a building, Richard said into the microphone. We cement a legacy. A testament to doing things the right way, no matter the cost. The crowd applauded. Richard raised the golden scissors. The heavy glass doors at the main entrance opened. State Building Inspector Hayes walked in. 2 uniformed state police officers walked right behind him. The applause died instantly. The room went entirely quiet. Hayes stopped in the middle of the center aisle. He didn't wait for the event music to fade. This site is under immediate and indefinite suspension by the State Building Authority, Hayes said. His voice carried without a microphone. Richard lowered the golden scissors. He did not look panicked. He looked like a king dealing with an annoying peasant. He turned to the private security guards standing near the entrance. Escort these men outside, Richard commanded. The guards took one look at the state police and didn't move. Richard adjusted his tie, gripping the edges of the podium. Inspector Hayes, you are making a career-ending mistake, Richard said. I had drinks with the zoning board chairman last night. You will be clearing out your desk by 3 o'clock. Richard raised his hand and pointed his finger directly at me. Standing in the back. My daughter is a disgruntled safety clerk. If she made a prank call to your office, she will be dealt with. But you are trespassing on private property. I didn't flinch. I just stood there and let him talk. Hayes did not look at my father. He looked past him, scanning the silent crowd. I am not here for the zoning board, Hayes said. I am looking for the author of Report Code 724. I need the chief structural engineer of record to step forward and verify these findings. I stepped away from the catering tables. I walked down the center aisle. The crowd parted. I walked past the local politicians and the investors. I reached the front row. Trevor was standing with my aunts and uncles. He crossed his arms, waiting for me to get arrested for making a fake report. I didn't stop. I walked up the 3 steps to the stage. I stepped up to the microphone, standing inches away from Richard. State license number 88314. I said. My voice was completely steady. I unzipped my canvas bag. I pulled out the heavy roll of paper. I dropped the blueprint onto the marble table next to the podium. The thick paper unrolled flat, The bright red structural engineer seal sat perfectly in the bottom right corner. My full legal name was stamped permanently in the center of the ink. Trevor leaned forward. His arms dropped to his sides. His mouth hung open slightly as he stared at the red stamp. And then at my face. He had spent 6 years treating me like an administrative nuisance. Now, he was looking at the senior engineer who had just trapped him in a federal crime. Behind him, my aunts and uncles stood in absolute silence, staring at the woman they had pitied all morning. 315 VIPs and media members watched the truth unfold. The press cameras started flashing rapidly, capturing the red ink, my name, and the state police walking up the stairs. Richard looked down at the blueprint. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. He reached out to grab the paper. His hand shook so violently his fingers couldn't grip the edge. His knees buckled. He fell heavily against the mahogany podium, sliding down the side of the wood. The oversized golden scissors slipped from his fingers. They hit the marble floor with a loud, sharp clatter that echoed through the flashing cameras. I looked down at him. I didn't say a word. The empire collapsed in a single afternoon. Federal fraud investigators followed Inspector Hayes into the ribbon cutting. And no amount of Richard's booming authority could outshout a warrant. Investors slipped out the side doors as troopers cuffed him. Trevor didn't even try to stand tall when they handed him his own warrant for forging safety records. He crumpled into a chair and sobbed like the reckless teenager Richard used to bail out. This time, no one could fix it. 52 days later, the accounts were frozen. The board dissolved. The banks moved in. I parked across from the site on a cold Tuesday. Engine running. 50 stories of hollow concrete, wrapped in police tape. Condemned by the state board after reviewing my core samples. My phone was already ringing with developers who wanted the engineer who caught the flaw before it killed anyone. I was moving forward, but I stood there a long time, watching the tape snap in the wind. My father had a choice 2 years ago: build a tower that would stand for a century, or bury the truth that his daughter was the better engineer. He chose the ruin. You're probably asking why I stayed 6 years, hiding my license behind a safety vest. Toxic families run like slot machines, just enough wins to keep you pulling the lever. I stayed hoping for the jackpot of respect. But I didn't just walk away from the machine. I let them underestimate me. Let an independent labs report do the talking instead of my word. And took my evidence straight to the state, past every local official my father owned. I lost my family. I saved thousands of lives.